My name doesn't matter, but what I saw does. Everyone believes that Tookie Williams was the absolute power, the undisputed architect of the Bloods, but that's the first lie they want you to believe. For decades, the media, law enforcement, even our own street lore, perpetuated this myth of Tookie as the ultimate authority, the strategic mind behind everything. I lived within that structure, rose through its ranks, and for a long time I believed it too. It was a comforting, albeit terrifying, narrative that made sense of the chaos. But the truth, the one I stumbled upon and barely escaped with, is far more chilling, far more calculated. It shatters the very foundation of what we thought we knew about power on the streets. What I encountered wasn't just a slight inaccuracy. It was a deliberate smokescreen, meticulously crafted to conceal the true puppeteer pulling the strings. This wasn't some flashy gangster seeking notoriety, but an enigmatic figure, a silent CEO operating in the deepest shadows, controlling an empire built on explicit violence and territorial claims that generated tens of millions annually. My journey into the heart of that organization, from the desperate struggle against poverty that drove me in, to the chilling discoveries I made, unveiled a different kind of power. It wasn't about the loudest voice or the biggest gun. It was about an almost preternatural understanding of logistics, finance, and human psychology. So, who is this invisible, intellectual archetype of power who truly pulled the strings behind the most feared gang in Los Angeles? How did someone so unassuming manage to orchestrate an entire illicit economy from the dark corners of South Central? And more importantly, what does this revelation truly mean for our understanding of organized crime and the systemic failures in addressing it? These aren't just questions. They're the scars I carry, the reason I'm speaking now. This is my confession, a reconstruction of a personal journey that exposed a truth so profound and dangerous it almost cost me everything. It's a story about the real nature of power, stripped bare of its theatrical facade. My name doesn't matter, but what I saw does. Everyone believes that Tookie Williams was the absolute power, the undisputed architect of the Bloods, but that's the first lie they want you to believe. For decades, the media, law enforcement, even our own street lore perpetuated this myth of Tookie as the ultimate authority, the strategic mind behind everything. I lived within that structure, rose through its ranks, and for a long time I believed it too. It was a comforting, albeit terrifying narrative that made sense of the chaos. But the truth, the one I stumbled upon and barely escaped with, is far more chilling, far more calculated. It shatters the very foundation of what we thought we knew about power on the streets. What I encountered wasn't just a slight inaccuracy. It was a deliberate smokescreen, meticulously crafted to conceal the true puppeteer pulling the strings. This wasn't some flashy gangster seeking notoriety, but an enigmatic figure, a silent CEO operating in the deepest shadows, controlling an empire built on explicit violence and territorial claims that generated tens of millions annually. My journey into the heart of that organization, from the desperate struggle against poverty that drove me in, to the chilling discoveries I made, unveiled a different kind of power. It wasn't about the loudest voice or the biggest gun. It was about an almost preternatural understanding of logistics, finance, and human psychology. So, who is this invisible intellectual archetype of power who truly pulled the strings behind the most feared gang in Los Angeles? How did someone so unassuming manage to orchestrate an entire illicit economy from the dark corners of South Central? And more importantly, what does this revelation truly mean for our understanding of organized crime and the systemic failures in addressing it? These aren't just questions. They're the scars I carry, the reason I'm speaking now. This is my confession, a reconstruction of a personal journey that exposed a truth so profound and dangerous, it almost cost me everything. It's a story about the real nature of power, stripped bare of its theatrical facade. South Central Los Angeles in the late 70s and early 80s wasn't just a place. It was a cage. Eviction notices were almost as common as sirens, and the air hung heavy with the smell of despair and stale exhaust fumes. My mother, God bless her soul, worked 2 jobs, but it was never enough. Her cough got worse with each passing winter, and the medical bills piled up like unread prayers. We were drowning, and the promises of a legitimate path felt like cruel jokes whispered by a world that didn't care. The streets, brutal as they were, offered a perverse kind of clarity. Join or perish. It wasn't malice that led me to the Bloods, but the cold, hard logic of survival. My first days were a blur of fear and forced swagger. The brutal initiations were designed to break you down, then rebuild you into something harder, something that belonged. I quickly learned the rules. Loyalty above all, respect earned through fear, and Tookie Williams was the undisputed king. His name was whispered with reverence and terror, a legend in the making. He was the figurehead, the enforcer, the very embodiment of the power we sought. Every command, every turf war, every new recruit seemed to flow directly from his will. He was the sun around which our violent, chaotic world revolved, and for a long time I bought into that narrative completely. The initial shock of the violence eventually dulled into a grim routine. I ran errands, moved packages, stood guard on corners, my senses always on high alert for rival gangs or the ever-present threat of a police cruiser. The organization was a well-oiled machine, its gears grinding. Out profit from drug distribution, extortion, and various illicit schemes. We were told Tookie was the mastermind, the strategic genius behind it all, orchestrating the multi-million-dollar empire with an iron fist. I saw him often in those early days, always surrounded by his lieutenants, his presence filling a room, a palpable aura of authority and raw power. He was exactly what I expected a gang leader to be. Then came the meeting, the one that cracked my carefully constructed worldview. It was held in a nondescript warehouse in Compton, far from our usual haunts, a place that felt deliberately sterile. The air was thick with tension, not just the usual pre-deal jitters, but something heavier, more expectant. All the top lieutenants were there, their faces grim, their usual bravado muted. Even Tookie, who strode in with his customary swagger, seemed different, a subtle tightness around his eyes I hadn't noticed before. We were waiting for someone important, a new buyer, I assumed, for the massive cocaine shipment that was the subject of the meeting. A few minutes later, a plain black sedan pulled up, almost silently. Out stepped a man, unassuming in every way. He wasn't flashy, didn't have an entourage, just a quiet presence. He wore a simple dark suit, almost scholarly, and carried a slim briefcase. I remember thinking he looked like a librarian or an accountant, certainly not someone who commanded respect in our world. My initial thought was that he was just a lawyer, or a money man, someone ancillary to the real power players. Someone Tookie had brought in to handle the boring paperwork. I dismissed him, my gaze still fixed on Tookie, who was now straightening his jacket, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture of deference. This was Mr. Silas. What followed was a scene that etched itself into my memory, shattering my understanding of power. Tookie Williams, the man whose name made hardened criminals flinch, stood before Mr. Silas not as an equal but as a subordinate. He presented the intricate plans for the new drug pipeline. Not with his usual declarative confidence, but with a nervous energy, his voice slightly lower, almost seeking approval. He meticulously detailed the logistics, the profits, the risks, his eyes flicking to Mr. Silas for a quiet nod, a subtle gesture of acceptance. Tookie's usual swagger was gone, replaced by an almost deferential posture, a stark contrast to his public image. It was like watching a lion bow to a house cat. The meeting ended, Mr. Silas melted back into the shadows as quietly as he had arrived, and Tookie resumed his usual domineering persona. But the image of his subservience lingered. My mind reeled. If Tookie, the feared co-founder, the undisputed architect of our world, bowed to this quiet, unassuming man, then what did that make Mr. Silas? And what did it make us? It was a cold splash of water on the face, washing away years of ingrained belief. The myth of Tookie as the ultimate authority crumbled in that moment, replaced by a chilling realization. There was a puppeteer, unseen and unheard, pulling the strings from the deepest shadows, and we were all just puppets. After that meeting with Mr. Silas, where Tookie bent his knee without a word, my eyes began to open, truly open, to the hidden gears of our world. It wasn't about the loudest roar or the most brutal display of force anymore. That was Tookie's domain, a carefully constructed illusion for the masses. Mr. Silas operated on a different plane, a level of cold, calculating efficiency that made our street-level violence seem almost childish. He wasn't interested in blood feuds or public displays of power. His power was derived from an almost preternatural understanding of how systems worked, logistics, finance, and most disturbingly the intricate wiring of the human mind. I started seeing his influence everywhere, subtle shifts, almost imperceptible nudges that guided our entire operation, always towards maximum profit, minimum traceable risk. It was a terrifying realization. One incident solidified this new understanding, a chilling example of his cold efficiency. A high-ranking member, a man we knew as Big Spike, had been siphoning off a substantial amount of funds from our drug distribution network for months. The street consensus was clear. He'd be made an example of publicly and brutally for such a blatant betrayal. We expected a bullet, a beating, a body left in an alley, but Mr. Silas handled it differently. There was no direct confrontation, no hit squad. Instead, within weeks, Big Spike's seemingly legitimate external businesses, a car wash, a small diner, began to crumble. Loans were called in, suppliers vanished, permits were revoked. It was a silent financial strangulation. Big Spike wasn't physically harmed, but he was ruined, his reputation destroyed, left with nothing but debt and a chilling message for anyone else considering disloyalty. It was like watching a corporate hostile takeover, not a gangland execution. Another incident, even more unsettling, revealed the breadth of his reach and his mastery of human psychology. There was Detective Miller, a relentless, incorruptible cop who had been a thorn in our side for years, always on our tails, never taking a bribe. We couldn't touch him directly without bringing too much heat. Mr. Silas found his vulnerability. Miller's estranged daughter was battling a rare, expensive illness. Through untraceable channels, the daughter suddenly received the life-saving treatment she desperately needed. Miller never knew the source, but that profound, unspoken debt subtly shifted his focus. His relentless pursuit of our core operations, the ones Mr. Silas truly cared about, seemed to subtly wane. It was a masterclass in silent manipulation, turning an enemy into an unwitting asset. These weren't isolated incidents. They were lessons, grim and undeniable, on the true nature of the power that governed our lives. Tookie was the brand, the fierce face plastered on the wanted posters, the one who drew the attention of law enforcement and the media. But Mr. Silas was the CEO, the hidden hand calculating every risk, optimizing every revenue stream, ensuring the empire's longevity. He understood that true power wasn't about public notoriety. It was about absolute control, exercised through unseen levers of finance and psychology. The violence we committed, the turf we fought over, it was all just noise, a smokescreen to distract from the quiet, meticulous work of the true architect. My initial shock morphed into a deeper, colder fear. We weren't just soldiers in a gang. We were cogs in a corporate machine. And Mr. Silas was its silent, ruthless operator. The call came on a Tuesday, late afternoon. Not from Mr. Silas, of course, but through one of his mid-level enforcers. A man named Ghost, who always spoke in a monotone, his face a mask. He simply relayed the directive. No emotion, no explanation needed. My childhood friend Manny was to be handled. Manny, who I'd known since we were 5, who'd shared my last piece of bread when we were starving, who'd stood by me through countless street brawls and whispered dreams of getting out. He wasn't a snitch, wasn't a traitor in the conventional sense. His indiscretion, Ghost explained, was far more insidious in Mr. Silas's eyes. He had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have seen, something that threatened the hidden architecture of the empire. The casualness of the order, given over a crackling phone line, was what hit me first. My blood ran cold, a feeling far more profound than any fear I'd known in a turf war. Manny. The name echoed in my mind, a stark contrast to the brutal task now laid before me. He was clumsy, a little too curious for his own good, but never malicious. He'd joined the Bloods after me, looking for the same escape from the crushing weight of poverty, believing in the same false promises of brotherhood. To be told to eliminate him, not for a betrayal of our street code, but for an accidental glance at some numbers, felt like a cruel joke. My hand trembled, gripping the receiver. The sounds of South Central outside my window suddenly muted, replaced by the deafening roar of my own disbelief. This wasn't justice. It was an act of pure, detached calculation, a chilling demonstration of Mr. Silas's reach. Ghost, in his flat, dead voice, elaborated slightly, painting a picture that solidified my horror. Manny, while on a routine delivery run to a seemingly legitimate front business, a small, unassuming dry cleaner near the docks, had inadvertently seen ledgers, not just any ledgers, but the intricate financial records detailing Mr. Silas's extensive money laundering network. These weren't street-level drug sales, these were millions of dollars, transactions disguised as legitimate business dealings, moving through shell corporations. Manny, with his innocent curiosity, had picked up a stray sheet, noticed odd discrepancies, and asked one too many questions, not realizing the depth of the abyss he was peering into. His curiosity was a death sentence, a threat to the invisible empire. It wasn't a matter of intent, it was a matter of exposure. That was the moment the true, terrifying nature of Mr. Silas's power fully revealed itself. It wasn't about loyalty, it was about efficiency. Manny was not being punished for treachery but for being an unforeseen liability, a loose thread in a meticulously woven financial tapestry. And in that chilling instant, I understood that if Manny, my childhood friend, could be so casually discarded for an accidental glimpse, then my own life, my own existence was equally disposable. I was just another cog, a tool to be used and then broken when no longer needed. Or worse, when I became an inconvenience. The fear that had always been a distant hum in my life, the fear of rivals or police, became a cold, sharp blade pressed against my own throat. This was a different kind of terror, an existential dread. The shock morphed into a burning, resolute certainty. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the instrument of Manny's quiet, calculated demise. Not when I saw so clearly that it could just as easily be me next week, next month. The moral line, once blurry in the haze of survival, solidified into an uncrossable chasm. This wasn't the life I'd signed up for, not even in my most desperate moments. The promise of protection and belonging had curdled into a cold, corporate-like mechanism that devoured its own. In that moment, staring at the phone, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm, I knew with every fiber of my being that I had to escape. Not just from the gang, but from the silent, suffocating grip of Mr. Silas, before I became another forgotten statistic in his invisible ledger. The decision was made, etched deep into my bones, but the fear intensified, now compounded by the immense challenge of survival. How do you disappear from a ghost? How do you sever ties with an entity that controls every aspect of your world, that knows every street, every connection, every weakness? The streets, which had once offered a twisted form of refuge, now felt like an elaborate trap. Every shadow a potential scout, every familiar face a potential informant. My mind immediately began to race, dissecting every resource, every contact, every potential escape route. The world around me, once seen through the lens of gang hierarchy, was now analyzed solely for its exits. The freedom I craved felt impossibly distant, a fragile hope against an overwhelming, unseen force. This was the beginning of my desperate flight. The decision to escape was a fire in my gut, but the execution was a slow, agonizing crawl through quicksand. I knew I couldn't just walk away. Mr. Silas's network was too vast, too meticulous. For months, I became a ghost within the ghost, working harder, taking on more dangerous runs. But every extra dollar earned was stashed away, hidden in worn shoeboxes and under loose floorboards, a small, desperate cache for a future I prayed for. The paranoia was a constant companion, a cold knot in my stomach. Every casual glance from a fellow member, every seemingly innocent question, felt like a probe. I had to appear utterly devoted, even as my mind raced, mapping escape routes, calculating risks, and trying to recall every distant relative or forgotten acquaintance who might offer a fleeting moment of sanctuary outside the city limits. The weight of that secret, the knowledge that a single misstep meant certain, silent death, was crushing. My exit was timed for a night when Tookie was away, locked down, and Mr. Silas's direct lieutenants were preoccupied with a major West Coast distribution deal. I contacted my aunt's cousin, a man I barely knew who drove a truck route up to Oregon. I offered him everything I had, a desperate plea disguised as a business proposition for a quick delivery of some packages. The night was a blur of adrenaline and muffled sounds. I left with nothing but the clothes on my back, a small backpack of cash, and the burning image of Manny's face in my mind. Slipping out of South Central was like shedding a second skin, a painful tearing away. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of eyes, every distant siren a direct pursuit. I lay low in the back of that truck, the hum of the road a terrifying lullaby, my heart hammering against my ribs, convinced every mile was just another step deeper into a trap. The first few months were a haze of anonymity and exhaustion. I changed my name, found a small dingy apartment in a forgotten corner of Portland, and took on menial jobs, washing dishes, stocking shelves, anything that paid cash and kept me invisible. The silence was deafening after the constant roar of South Central, the absence of sirens and gunshots a strange, unsettling quiet. I learned to blend, to keep my head down, to erase every trace of the person I once was. With each passing day, each unnoticed sunrise, a fragile seed of hope began to sprout. I started to believe, truly believe, that I had done it. That I had slipped through the cracks of Mr. Silas's pervasive reach. The air seemed lighter. The burden on my shoulders seemed to lessen. And for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something akin to peace. This new, quiet life felt like a miracle. Years turned into a semblance of routine. I built a modest life, a quiet existence devoid of the old dangers. I even dared to make a few acquaintances, people who knew nothing of my past, who saw only a reserved, hard-working man. The initial terror of discovery faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that I was truly free. I told myself Mr. Silas had bigger fish to fry, that I was just a forgotten grunt, not worth the effort. The illusion of freedom was powerful, intoxicating. I could walk down the street without looking over my shoulder, sleep through the night without the gnawing fear. Yet, a part of me, deep down, knew it was a fragile peace. It was a freedom bought with constant vigilance, a life lived under an invisible, ever-present cloud. I was out, yes, but the shadow of Mr. Silas, the true architect of the empire, never truly lifted. I was free, but never truly safe. I had almost forgotten the true taste of fear, replaced by the mundane rhythm of my new life in Portland. Years had passed since I'd slipped away. Convinced I was just a forgotten ghost in Mr. Silas's vast, dark empire. I'd even started to relax, to build something resembling a future. Then, one Tuesday, I saw a car. A dark sedan, just like the one Mr. Silas used, parked 2 blocks from my apartment. It was probably nothing, a coincidence, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. The air suddenly felt heavier, charged with an unspoken dread. My carefully constructed peace began to crack, and I felt the familiar, unwelcome prickle of paranoia, returning, like a forgotten phantom limb suddenly aching, reminding me of a past I thought was buried. The next day, it wasn't the car, but the man. He was waiting for me outside the diner where I washed dishes, leaning against the brick wall, a dark fedora pulled low, his face obscured. Not ghost, but someone cut from the same cloth, quiet, utterly devoid of expression. He didn't speak, just gave a subtle nod towards a parked car further down the block. My heart hammered, a frantic drum, against the overwhelming silence of the street. There was no struggle, no overt threat, just an undeniable certainty in his posture. It was like a prearranged appointment I had unknowingly made years ago. I got in, the back seat chillingly clean, the air inside sterile. The door clicked shut, a soft final sound that echoed the closing of a cage. The drive was short, silent. We pulled into a nondescript office building, the kind where dreams go to die. Inside, at a polished conference table, sat a man I didn't recognize, but whose eyes held the same cold, assessing intelligence I'd seen in Mr. Silas's inner circle. He spoke, his voice calm, almost polite. "Lil Red," he began. "Your absence was noted, of course. Your departure was permitted." The words hit me like a physical blow. Permitted, not escaped. My freedom had been a calculated illusion, a leash extended. He explained my value as an uncompromised asset. A ghost was now being leveraged. There was no anger, no accusation, just a detached statement of fact, confirming my worst fears. My escape was a test, a long-term strategic play I never knew I was part of. The terms were laid out, not as a demand, but as a pre-existing condition of my freedom. From now on, I would be a silent observer, an anonymous pair of eyes and ears, activated only when needed, a rare resource for Mr. Silas's external interests. My sentence was perpetual vigilance, a life lived forever on the periphery, knowing that a single misstep, a single betrayal of this unspoken agreement, would be my true end. The crushing weight of it all settled upon me. I wasn't merely out, I was in a different, larger cage, one without bars, but with an invisible, omnipresent warden. The silence I had once cherished now felt like the chilling quiet of an inescapable well. My name might not matter, but my existence, my every breath, was still tethered to the shadow I had tried so desperately to outrun. Mr. Silas embodies a philosophy of power that transcends the street-level brutality most people associate with organized crime. His genius lies in understanding that true control isn't about the loudest roar or the most blood spilled, but about the silent, meticulous manipulation of systems, finance, logistics, and, most chillingly, human psychology. While the world focused on the likes of Tookie Williams, the visible violent figurehead, Mr. Silas was building an empire designed for longevity, impervious to the usual law. Enforcement tactics. The war on drugs, as it's waged, is a tragic farce, perpetually chasing shadows because it refuses to acknowledge the true architects. They target the theatrical spectacle, the street soldiers, while the real power, the intellectual capital that fuels and sustains these illicit economies, remains invisible, unmolested, and ultimately, triumphant. And this is the bitter truth I carry. the real sentence of my freedom. As long as the public, and even law enforcement, remains fixated on the visible puppets, the Mr. Silases of the world will continue to operate from their silent boardrooms, pulling strings no one even knows exist. My escape wasn't an escape at all. It was merely a transition from one cage to another. A life lived under an invisible, perpetual threat. I am a ghost, yes, but a ghost haunted by the knowledge that I am forever a loose end in someone else's ledger, and that my every breath is a calculated allowance. This is my freedom. To live with the chilling certainty that the true master never truly releases his hold, a constant reminder that I am merely a pawn in a game far grander and more terrifying than any street corner could ever reveal.